Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today we're going to tackle C.S. Lewis, specifically his approach to Christian apologetics.
Ah, Lewis.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff. We've got this research paper, C.S. Lewis's Arguments for Christianity. And it's great. It really breaks down his thinking chapter by chapter.
Yeah, I've seen that one.
It's really well done. One thing I find so interesting about Lewis, he wasn't always a believer.
Oh, totally. He actually called himself a reluctant convert, which I think makes his eventual, embrace of Christianity even more compelling. Like, it wasn't just some, blind leap of faith, but like a real reasoned journey.
Yeah, exactly. And that comes through in his writing, I think. So the paper jumps right in. Chapter 1, The Moral Law.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one.
Yeah. So basically, Lewis observed that humans, like no matter where they come from, what culture, seem to have this like built-in sense of right and wrong.
Right, and that's a key point. He argues that this moral compass, it points to something beyond just our own, like, personal preferences or what our society tells us. Like, even think about kids. When they argue, they appeal to fairness.
It's true. They do.
It's like there's some standard outside of themselves.
So it's not just like, I want this, but this should be this way.
Right, exactly. Ought versus want. And Lewis found that so important.
Yeah. But couldn't someone say, well, it's just instinct? Or, just how we're raised?
Oh, Lewis tackles those counter-arguments head on. Don't worry.
Good, good.
He says instinct, maybe for some behaviors, but it doesn't really explain why we feel we should do the right thing even when it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
And social conditionings, too. Like, if morality was totally relative, just a product of culture, then good and evil, they'd be totally relative, wouldn't they?
Right, like one culture is good as another culture is, evil, whatever. No way to really judge.
Exactly. But Lewis is saying, even though how morality looks might be different between cultures, there's this underlying sense of right and wrong that's surprisingly universal.
So the question is, where does this universal sense come from? If it's not just from us, then what?
Exactly the question Lewis wants us to wrestle with. And that's where things get really interesting. He uses the analogy of a game like the moral law is the rules of the game.
Right, I like that.
Keep society functioning. But then who sets the rules? Okay, chapter 2 gets a little more personal.
Oh.
Lewis introduces the argument from desire. He connects it to this concept of joy, or Sehnsucht, that German word.
I've heard of that.
It's about longing, this deep longing we all have, a yearning for something that the world just can't satisfy.
I feel that.
Lewis actually felt it as a kid. He talks about being captivated by stories like Beatrix Potter's Squirrel Nutkin or those Norse myths. So it's like there's this moment of wonder and beauty, but it's also like, ouch, because it feels incomplete, like we're reaching for something just out of reach.
I get that. It's like that, but also an ouch at the same time.
Exactly, and that's the whole point, right? In the natural world, Lewis points out, desires usually have like a matching satisfaction. Hungry, you eat. Thirsty, you drink. But what about these like deeper longings for meaning, or perfect love, transcendence?
Mm-hmm.
What if those point to something like totally beyond the material world?
Okay, yeah, I can see where this is going. Like, if our hearts are wired to yearn for something this world can't give, maybe it means we were actually made for another world. One where those desires actually fit.
Exactly. It flips the script on longing. Okay, chapter 3, and I bet you know what's coming. One of Lewis's most famous arguments.
Let me guess. The liar, lunatic, or Lord?
Boom. You got it. He goes straight for the identity of Jesus.
Bold move.
Right? So he lays out the options. Either Jesus was a liar, just straight up deceiving people, or a lunatic, like genuinely believed stuff that wasn't true.
Or he was who he said he was.
Right. And if you read Lewis, he systematically takes apart those first two options.
Oh, he does.
He argues that, like, the moral teaching of Jesus and how much he impacted history, it just doesn't fit with liar or lunatic,
It's sense.
It's not blind faith here. Lewis is saying, look at the evidence.
So the Lord option is what he's saying is most reasonable, based on what we know. Still a leap of faith, though, right?
Well, yeah, that's part of it. Okay, how about this? How does Lewis explain morality itself, like what it even is?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Huge. So chapter 4, Lewis uses this honestly brilliant analogy, a fleet of ships,
okay,
to explain Christian morality. He says it's got 3 parts. First, social harmony, right? Like ships avoiding crashing into each other.
Right, okay.
That's about just laws, treating each other right, the basics for living together.
Yeah, makes sense. We need rules of the road. But it's got to be more than just avoiding collisions, right?
You got it. Second part, internal virtue. Lewis compares this to keeping each ship, like, seaworthy,
So the condition of the ship itself.
Right, like are you honest, courageous, humble? It's that inner stuff, developing your character, what makes you actually good.
Not just what you do, but what's inside. But where's purpose fit in all this?
That's the third part. Teleological purpose, fancy word. Basically, Lewis says a fleet needs a destination, right?
Gotta have somewhere to go.
Same with us. For humans, that purpose comes from aligning ourselves with what God wants, the big plan.
So it's bigger than just following rules or even being a good person. It's about, like, our role in the universe, our ultimate purpose. Wow. We're only on chapter 4, and this is getting deep.
Buckle up. It's only going to get deeper from here. Chapter 5 takes on this classic debate, faith versus works. And as always, Lewis has a nuanced take.
Oh boy, that's a big one. Is it what we believe or what we do? I'm guessing Lewis doesn't pick a side so easily.
You know Lewis better than that. He uses this analogy, a pair of scissors. Faith and works, they're like the two blades, they need each other.
Clever.
Right. Salvation, he says, is a gift from God. Theologians call it grace. But we got to respond to that, and that's where faith comes in.
So not earning it, but responding to it.
Exactly. Didn't he use like a drowning man example for this?
Oh yeah, I think so.
God's the rescuer throwing the life preserver, but the guy drowning, he still has to choose to grab on.
Such a vivid image.
Right. God's power, but also our choice all mixed together. Okay, chapter 6 gets kind of tough. Forgiveness and love.
Ooh, yeah.
Lewis actually calls this the unnatural command because, let's be real, it goes against our gut reaction, right? Love your neighbor and your enemy.
Not just like them, but...
Not just feelings. He's clear about that. It's about choosing to do good for them even when they suck.
That is tough.
Radical stuff, not about liking everyone, but actively willing good for them, treating them right even when it's hard.
And how does this connect to God?
Lewis ties it right back to God's nature. He says God doesn't love us because we deserve it, but because he is love. Like that's his very being. And we're supposed to reflect that radical, unearned love and forgiveness.
That's a lot to live up to.
Tell me about it. Okay, on to chapter 7, and I like this title, Mere Christianity, the Hallway and the Rooms. What's that about?
Sounds intriguing.
Lewis gets meta here, talking about mere Christianity itself. His analogy is a house. Christianity is the house. It's got this central hallway that's mere Christianity, and then all these rooms off of it, the denominations.
Okay, I think I see where this is going.
He says there are core beliefs that, like, all Christians share, no matter the room they're in. Things like the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, incarnation, atonement, resurrection, the big stuff.
So he's not saying all denominations are exactly the same, but there's that shared essence. I like that hallway image. Like, find that common ground, then you can go explore the specific rooms.
Exactly. Lewis sees value in the differences, but starting in the hallway with their shared essentials, that's what gives you the big picture.
Love it. Okay, chapter 8, and this is a weighty one. Pride. What does Lewis say about it?
Oh, he doesn't hold back. Pride is the root of all vice, the most sneaky sin. And he's careful to say it's not the same as healthy self-esteem or being proud of what you achieved.
Good distinction.
Right. True pride, for Lewis, it's about, like, being self-centered, competitive, putting yourself at the center, rejecting God, and looking down on others.
He's got that line in the Pilgrim's Redress, right? There are no rules that apply to us. Above such matters we are. It's chilling.
It really is. And Lewis points out how pride creates, like, this enmity with God and other people. You can't see your need for grace. You can't connect genuinely. It blocks humility.
So how do we combat that?
Humility, of course. Recognizing we aren't the center of everything.
Okay, get ready. Chapter 9 goes deep. The problem of evil.
There we go.
Yeah, this one trips a lot of people up. So how does Lewis approach it?
It might surprise you, but he actually says the existence of evil can be evidence for God.
Wait, really? How's that work? I thought evil was the argument against God.
Right. But here's the thing. Lewis says the very concept of evil, it means there's a moral standard, right? We wouldn't know something was evil if we didn't have an idea of good.
So we know cruelty's wrong, kindness is right, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And that implies there's this standard, a moral law, like we talked about before, that's outside of us.
So being able to recognize evil, it actually points to a higher moral authority.
Exactly. And Lewis also takes on those ideas, like dualism, where there's a good God and an evil God battling it out.
Oh yeah, I've heard that one.
He says that doesn't explain where the standard for good comes from in the first place. There needs to be, like, a higher lawgiver. And for Lewis, that's God.
Makes you think.
Definitely. Okay, after all that, what's next?
I'm almost afraid to ask.
Chapter 10, we circle back to mere Christianity.
Ah, so back to the basics.
In a way, yeah, Lewis really hammers home those 3 pillars he mentioned before: Christ's divinity, atonement, and the resurrection. These are like the non-negotiables for him.
The absolute core of Christian belief.
Right. Now, denominational differences, while interesting, are secondary to those core beliefs. It's like focus on the foundation that makes you Christian. Don't get lost in the details that can divide people.
Especially in today's world with so much division, that mere Christianity idea seems really important.
So important. It's about unity amidst diversity, remembering those truths that bind us as Christians, even if we don't see eye to eye on every little thing.
Okay, let's move on. Chapter 11 shifts gears a bit. Time for the Pilgrim's Redress.
One of his most famous works.
Yeah. Why is this book so important to his apologetics?
It's an allegory, right? And it kind of reflects Lewis's own spiritual journey. The main guy, John, he's on this quest for joy, which is basically Lewis searching for meaning and truth.
So, a fictionalized version of how he became a Christian, but with deeper meaning, symbolism woven in.
You got it. The book's full of these interesting characters and encounters, each representing different philosophies or worldviews that Lewis actually struggled with.
It's like a journey through ideas, then leading to Christianity as the ultimate answer.
Precisely. Okay, so chapter 12 digs deeper into those critiques of different philosophies that Lewis puts in The Pilgrim's Redress. What are the main takeaways?
Okay, yeah, I'm curious about that.
So he uses these allegorical figures to represent the philosophies, right? So it's not just dry arguments. It's like John interacting with a character who embodies materialism, another who's all about Freudianism, that kind of thing.
It makes it more engaging then.
Way more. And it shows how those ideas play out in someone's life and why they don't actually satisfy. It's brilliant.
Lewis is really good at using stories and analogies to make these complex ideas understandable.
Oh, absolutely. He knew that imagination could capture the heart, not just the mind. Okay, chapter 13 goes back to Lewis's roots, specifically how Puritan theology influenced how he saw conversion.
That's interesting.
Right. So Lewis came from this Ulster Protestant background, which was big on the process of conversion. And we see that in The Pilgrim's Regress, how John's journey unfolds.
It's not just a one-time decision then, but like stages, a whole process.
Exactly. There's recognizing sin, turning away from it, and moving toward a life of, holiness.
Deep stuff.
Deep. Okay, last chapter 14. Tell me about these landlord's rules in The Pilgrim's Redress.
Landlord's rules. Okay, what are those all about?
This is a motif throughout the book. The landlord is God, and the rules are basically that moral law, the objective right and wrong that Lewis keeps coming back to.
I'm guessing when John rebels against the rules, that's when things go wrong.
Exactly. It's like the consequence of sin, of turning away from how God designed us to live.
And it's not always super clear what those rules are, which adds another layer, right? It's not just blind obedience, but understanding God's character, seeking his wisdom.
You got it. It's about the heart behind the rules, the principles of goodness and love that make life truly good.
Wow, we covered a lot. Moral law, evil, faith, works. It's a lot to take in.
It's Lewis. He never shied away from the big questions.
That's for sure. My brain is definitely feeling stretched. But in a good way.
That's what we're here for.
Can't wait to see where we go in the next part of this deep dive.
It's amazing, though, how relevant his stuff still feels. Like he was writing decades ago, but...
I know. It's like he was wrestling with the same questions we are even now.
Totally. And the paper actually talks about why Lewis's work still resonates, even in a world that's, often pretty skeptical of faith.
Oh, interesting. What do they say?
Well, one big thing is how Lewis connects with, human experience. He wasn't just some... professor in an ivory tower.
He'd been there.
Yeah, he'd been an atheist, had doubts, the whole struggle. So when he talks about faith, it's like he gets it.
It's more relatable.
Way more. Like he's that friend who's read everything, explored all the arguments, and then he's like, hey, check this out. I found something really cool.
That's a good way to put it. It's an invitation to discover something together.
Right. And because he'd been there, he could see the objections coming, address them head on.
Makes his argument stronger.
Totally. Plus, the paper talks about his writing style. Clear, concise, even funny sometimes, which is hard when you're talking about this heavy stuff.
Yeah, philosophy and theology aren't exactly known for their humor.
Right, but Lewis, he had this knack for analogies that, just stick with you. The fleet of ships, the hallway and rooms,
They make those abstract ideas click into place. You don't need a philosophy degree to get it.
Exactly. But I think it goes beyond the writing, too. He was grappling with these huge questions, the kind that never really go away. Does God exist? What's life all about? Why is there suffering? We all ask those things.
It's the human condition.
Right. And he wasn't giving easy answers either. He really wrestled with them, and that honesty, it draws people in even if they don't agree in the end.
It shows respect for the reader, he's inviting us to think along with him.
Totally. The paper also mentions the historical context. Lewis was writing during crazy times, World War II, totalitarian regimes on the rise.
Dark times.
Yeah. So his work offered this sense of hope and moral clarity when the world felt like it was falling apart.
I can see that. People are looking for something solid to hold on to when everything else is uncertain.
Exactly. And even though the specific context has changed, that need for meaning, for purpose, when things feel chaotic, that's still there.
It's timeless.
Totally. And that's why his argument about objective truth, moral values, they're so relevant now. In a culture where everything's relative, your truth, my truth.
It's refreshing.
Lewis is pushing back on that. He's saying, no, there's a moral law that's bigger than us, bigger than our feelings.
Like some things are just right or wrong, period.
Exactly. And his insights into human nature, especially pride, man, so relevant today.
What did he say about pride?
He saw how pride, that focus on me, always needing to be better than others, it leads to conflict, brokenness.
It's like he diagnosed a societal illness.
Right. And maybe it's even worse now with social media and everything. That obsession with status, comparison, always needing to be right.
A recipe for unhappiness.
For sure. And the paper points out Lewis's emphasis on mere Christianity, that core of the faith. It's an antidote to all that division we see,
Within the church and outside it.
Exactly. It's a call for unity and diversity, remembering those fundamental truths that make us Christian, even if we don't agree on every little point of doctrine.
Finding that common ground, the hallway before the separate rooms.
Love that image. So we've got a reluctant convert, master of analogy, tackles the big questions, offers hope, and champions these timeless truths. No wonder he's still so popular.
He's a powerhouse.
He is. And don't forget, he wasn't just an apologist. Storyteller, literary scholar, poet.
Right. Narnia.
Exactly. He got how powerful imagination is, how creativity can convey truth.
The Pilgrim's Regress is like that, right? It's not just some boring theology book. It's an adventure.
Totally. Symbols, humor, those moments where you're like, whoa, I never thought of it like that. It speaks to this idea that truth can be found in unexpected places.
Sometimes a good story can get to you in a way that an argument can't.
Totally. So for our listeners who, might be inspired to actually check out Lewis, where should they start?
That's a good question. What do you recommend?
Well, Mere Christianity, it's a classic for a reason. It's his most, I think, accessible work, lays out those core Christian beliefs really well.
That's a good entry point.
Yeah, like step right into the hallway. And then if you're up for something a bit more challenging but super rewarding, The Pilgrim's Regress.
It's a bit denser, right?
It is, but it's the kind of book you can read again and again, and each time find something new.
It's like an intellectual treasure hunt.
Love that. And don't forget the fiction. The Chronicles of Narnia, they're way more than kids' stories.
Oh, for sure.
Full of symbolism, allegory, good versus evil, redemption, the power of faith.
It's great how good stories can work on different levels, right? You can enjoy it as a kid, then read it again as an adult and be like, whoa, there's a whole other layer here.
Exactly. And for the super hardcore Lewis fans, there are tons of biographies, scholarly works, going into his life, his influences.
You could spend a lifetime studying him.
You could. It's pretty amazing the impact he's had. Even if you don't agree with everything he said, he's worth reading.
Challenging, thought-provoking.
Absolutely. So as we head into the last part of our deep dive, what's standing out to you? What's, really resonating?
Honestly, it's that emphasis on mere Christianity, especially now when everything's so divided. It's easy to get caught up in the arguments, But Lewis reminds us what we share. We have more in common than we think.
I love that. Focusing on the foundation, what unites us. But we also got to remember, Lewis wasn't without his critics.
Oh, yeah. No one's perfect.
Right. And even people who admire him, they have concerns, valid critiques.
So in this last part, we're going to explore some of those challenges to Lewis's thinking. It's about looking at his work with a critical eye, realizing that even those we admire might have views that are, problematic or outdated.
It's about being honest, thoughtful, acknowledging both the good and the not so good.
Right. So buckle up, listeners. We're about to get into some potentially controversial territory. Okay, so we're back and ready to, dive into some of the criticisms of C.S. Lewis, as much as we've been praising him.
It's important to remember, nobody's perfect. Even Lewis.
Right, exactly. So what are some of the common objections people have to his work? What are the critiques?
Well, one thing people bring up is, sometimes Lewis can be a bit too simplistic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Some scholars say he, oversimplifies these complex philosophical and theological issues to make them easy to understand.
So it's great for getting started, but maybe you're missing some of the nuance.
Exactly. Especially if, you only read his, intro-level stuff. There's always the risk of, not going deeper.
Makes sense. What else do people say?
Another common critique is that he relies too much on logic and reason when he's arguing for faith.
Interesting.
Yeah, some folks, especially those who come from more mystical or experiential traditions, they feel like faith is ultimately about like a personal encounter with God.
Right.
Something you can't just like reason your way into. It's that head versus heart thing.
So for them, it's not just about intellectual arguments. It's about feeling it, living it.
Right. And while Lewis did acknowledge personal experience, his main approach was through logic. So for some, it can feel a bit cold, maybe, detached from, what faith actually feels like.
Yeah, I can see that. It's like different people connect to these questions in different ways. Some through the head, some through the heart.
Totally. And there's room for all of that in Christianity. Lewis is just one perspective.
Right, right. Okay, here's another critique I've heard, and this one can be a bit sensitive. But some of Lewis's views on things like gender roles or social issues, they haven't aged very well.
Yeah, that's a tough one, but it's a valid concern.
Like to modern readers, some of it can be, offensive, honestly.
We got to remember, Lewis was writing in a different time. His views reflect the norms of his era.
It's hard to separate the person from the time period, I guess.
Yeah, it is. So when we read Lewis today, we got to keep that historical context in mind and read critically. We can appreciate his insights, but also say, hey, this part, not so much.
It's like nobody's perfect, even those we admire.
Exactly. We got to engage with all ideas with, discernment.
And that includes Lewis, even though, we've been focusing on the positive. But being critical, that's part of learning, right?
It is. And honestly, I think Lewis would have agreed. He believed in being humble intellectually, being open to having your mind changed, your perspective broadened.
So even as a strong Christian, he was okay with arguing, debating.
Totally. He saw that as part of the journey.
So it's good to wrestle with these things, even the stuff that makes us uncomfortable.
Definitely. It's how we grow.
So engaging with a thinker like Lewis, it's not about just agreeing with everything he said. It's about grappling with it, thinking for yourself.
Exactly. Take what's valuable to you, leave what isn't, and keep the conversation going.
It's like a starting point, not the end of the journey.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this whole deep dive, what's one final thought we can leave people with? Something to ponder,
Good question. How about this? What's one thing Lewis said that really challenges you, and why?
Oh, I like that. It's not just, did you like Lewis, yes or no? It's about really thinking about his ideas. Which ones push your buttons a little?
Right. And maybe it sparks some conversations, with friends, family, whoever, because that's what this is all about, sparking that curiosity and keeping the exploration going.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, listeners, that's it for our deep dive on C.S. Lewis.
But keep thinking, keep questioning, keep exploring.
Exactly. Until next time.